Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. On Wednesday evenings at 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, my wife and I host a weekly parent meeting for any parents associated with the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and normally they're really open discussions for homeschooling parents to get together and just ask any questions they have, raise any issues or topics, and we discuss them as a group. And these Wednesday night meetings, I think that they're helpful for those who participate based on feedback that we receive and also based on the encouragement that I usually walk away from those meetings with. I really enjoy the discussions, and we get into all sorts of practical discussions about parenting and family life and homeschooling. But we also talk some philosophical topics, some religious topics that relate to the work that we have to do. So lots of issues come up, many different topics, and very interestingly, each week there seems to be a certain theme that emerges in the night's discussion. We start the meetings, as I said, around 9 p.m., and we simply continue the discussions until everything quiets down. Sometimes it can be 3 hours the discussions go on. So we talk about a wide range of topics, and as we continue these discussions week by week, it allows us as a group to become something of a community and move deeper and deeper into these issues. And that's where the real benefits of these discussions increasingly comes from. It comes from that depth that we're able to enter into by continuing the discussions while adding to these discussions ongoing experience in our work as parents and Catholics, as homeschooling parents, students ourselves, and so on. What I'd like to do today is share a talk in which I summarize a number of the issues that we've discussed in these weekly meetings, and what I'd like to share are actually 8 answers to the question, what's necessary for success in homeschooling? What's necessary for success in homeschooling? I'd like to share 8 points that, as I said, I've gleaned from reflecting on our weekly discussions, things that I've discussed with my own wife, because we've been homeschooling for 25 years now. And especially as our kids become adults and move on, and we now get to experience their adult life together while still homeschooling younger children, a lot of these principles have become pretty clear. And I think this will be especially helpful for families new to homeschooling or considering homeschooling, but also parents who are just smack in the middle of everything, just in the grind of the homeschooling years. So I'd like to share some of this is wisdom gained in hindsight. I've learned a number of things by making mistakes, and the good thing about making mistakes is that it allows us to correct our errors if we've still got younger children, but we can also share the mistakes that we've made and the lessons we've learned from those mistakes with younger parents, and they can avoid those mistakes and enjoy better results, happier results, which is our goal. So I'd like to share 8 points, 8 things that I think we need to focus on to have success in homeschooling, because it's an extraordinary challenge and it requires real virtue, real character, real principles, as we'll see. And we've got to get these principles sorted out as early as possible so we can focus on them, because they're going to carry us through all the work that needs to be done. So let's talk about what's necessary for success in homeschooling. The first point that I'd like to discuss is that homeschooling needs to be collaborative. Homeschooling needs to be collaborative. And by that I mean there needs to be agreement between a husband and a wife when it comes to the decision to homeschool. And I'd like to ask you to please hold off on guessing what I'm going to say, because I probably don't mean what you think I'm going to talk about. When I say that homeschooling needs to be collaborative, it simply means that it's a goal that a husband and wife need to commit to together. What I'm not saying is that they need to do it together, that they need to homeschool together, that they need to split it 50-50. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the husband and wife need to agree that they're going to homeschool. That doesn't mean they both need to love the idea. And again, it doesn't mean they need to split the duties of homeschooling. In fact, I don't think that will work very well in most cases. But they need to agree on it. And it needs to be something that they collaborate on. They need to communicate in figuring out, what they need to do. And as we talk about these other points, these are the sorts of things that they'll need to work out, but they've got to be committed to this. There needs to be a certain sense of, a shared sense of necessity. They have to believe that homeschooling in their circumstances is necessary. There's no schools locally that are satisfying to them, that promote their convictions and values. They have to believe that for them, in their circumstances, homeschooling is necessary. And then, seeing it as necessary, they need to discuss how they can go about providing for the education of their own children. They need to find a plan. And I'll just share, in my own family, between my wife and I, even though I'm obviously a teacher and busy in education, we've actually found that the best arrangement is not to have me as the head of the household involved in the daily homeschool activity, but to leave that entirely for my wife, and to have me take upon myself entirely the work of providing, focusing on my own work and career and working to provide everything that my wife and children need to succeed in homeschooling. So we've divided the work of homeschooling. We collaborate in homeschooling, not by splitting the homeschool activities or collaborating in the actual teaching of the children, but think of it more broadly. Think of all of the responsibilities of the household, all of the work that needs to be done, all of the resources that are needed, all of the arrangements that are needed, the house, the schedule, the supplies, the freedom for my wife to be able to devote herself to the children, all of those things that need to be done in order to successfully homeschool the children. We've laid all of those tasks and responsibilities out on the table, as it were, and found a way to provide for them by me devoting myself entirely to my life's work and my wife devoting herself entirely to the children's education. So when I say collaborate or that homeschooling needs to be collaborative, you need to get all of the work of the household, everything that needs to get done for the household on the table, as it were, and divide those responsibilities. And I think it's better to provide for the mother to devote herself to the work of homeschooling, and for the father to devote himself to the work of providing for the mother so that she can devote herself to homeschooling. The father basically creates the opportunity for the mother to devote herself to homeschooling, and then the mother actually carries out that work of homeschooling. I think that division of labor would be what I recommend for a number of reasons, especially as kids get older. There's quite a bit of money and resources and supplies that are needed. And so I think it's important for the head of the household to stay focused on his professional work, because supplying the family's needs is really going to be essential for success in homeschooling long term. So there needs to be collaboration between the husband and wife. They've got to agree that homeschooling is good and necessary for their family. They've got to have a clear and comprehensive sense of the duties of the household that need to be fulfilled, and then they've got to divide those duties for success. And they've got to make sure that attention is available to focus on all the work that needs to be done for the children's education. So homeschooling, to be successful, needs to be collaborative. Secondly, it needs to be principled. Homeschooling needs to be principled. When I look at the homeschool community, I get stressed because I often see that it's not principled, and parents are talking about books and resources and what curriculum they're going to use, and they're collecting catalogs and going to homeschool conferences and placing orders and reading book reviews and all this kind of stuff, and it's all of this product information and reviews and comparisons. And I talk about this all the time, but if I ask parents, what are your goals? What are your foundational principles that are directing your work in homeschooling? I get blank stares. Homeschooling, in order to be successful, has to be principled. There have to be a number of foundational, unchanging principles that are focused on, that really are the pillars of the family's work in homeschooling. And the reason why that is so important is because, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, there are going to be all kinds of challenges to homeschooling. The family is going to go through different seasons of life. Mom may go through pregnancies. She may be taking care of infants and toddlers and have children going into adulthood. Dad may go through all different seasons and challenges with work and household management. There are going to be all sorts of challenges, all kinds of adversity over the years in homeschooling. And there have to be principles that serve as pillars or anchors to the family's work in homeschooling, that allow them to stay focused and persevere through all of these changes that come inevitably over the years in family life, because life as a lay person, life in the world is constantly changing, and constantly adapting to those changes is the nature of the work as lay people. And the work has to have principles to focus on. It has to have goals. There has to be direction, or else, you're just like a leaf being tossed about by the wind, which is the characteristic of a foolish person. So you've got to have clear guiding principles. You've got to have goals that are appropriate for homeschooling. Many parents talk about goals, and they say things that really aren't appropriate. They'll say things like, we want to get our kids to heaven, or we want to raise saints. And that sounds good. I call those Sunday school answers. It sounds good, but how do you measure whether or not you have successfully got your kid to heaven when the child is 7 or 9 or 12 or 15? That's not a measurable goal. It's not a goal that's appropriate to homeschooling. And so you've got to think of goals that you can actually write down and then pursue and then measure, things you can actually achieve, things like satisfying the requirements for standardized testing at each grade level. That's something that can be done and measured. Getting through a certain amount of content in a certain scheduled amount of time, that's something that can be measured. Committing to actually having a certain number of hours of school work, a certain number of days of the week or of the year, that's something that can be measurable. That's an appropriate goal for homeschooling. So there has to be principles. If you'd like some suggestions of principles, what I recommend is that you start by reading the free book that we make available, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. The purpose of that book is to help parents understand the principles and history of classical Catholic education. So it gives you that sort of top-down or bird's eye view of classical Catholic education that allows you to establish some clear principles, some clear goals in your homeschooling, things you can cling to through the years as unchanging truths and goals that you'll just never relinquish no matter what's going on. You need to make sure that those things are clear as you get started and continue to work to clarify them as you begin with homeschooling and continue in homeschooling. So it's got to be principled. That's number 2. Number 1 was it's got to be collaborative. Number 2, it's got to be principled. Number 3, it's got to be organized. Homeschooling has to be organized. When you talk about collaborating in homeschool, when you talk about having principles and goals in homeschooling, work has to be done in administering the homeschool so that the activities of the day, the things that are done, the practical details, how the house is arranged, how the schedule is arranged, all of these practical details need to be thought about and ordered or organized so that the goals can be accomplished. We've got to have clear goals, but we've also got to work those goals down to the practical level, to the task level. We've got to ask, where is this going to be done? How is the house going to be arranged so that these things can be done? How is the schedule going to be arranged? I often get asked by parents, how many hours a day should the kids study, or what sort of schedule should we follow? And I stop the parents there and I say, there's much more to think about. You've got to live a full Catholic life. You've got lots of responsibilities. And so you've got to have a schedule that provides for all of those needs. You can't just get into this, narrow-minded view of homeschooling and then ignore other things. Like you can't ignore physical health, for example. You've got to have exercise. You've got to have work and develop physical strength. You've got social responsibilities. You've got grandparents to think about and care for. You have relatives, neighbors who may need help. You've got parish life to participate in, sacramental life, prayer life, professional life. All of these responsibilities have to be taken care of, and they've all got to be worked out in time and space and resources through organization. And that work of management, that's the principal work of the head of the household. But a lot of that work also needs to be organized by the mother, because she is the one who's normally at home with the children, directing the children through the day and so on. So the work has to be collaborative and it's got to be principled, but it's got to be organized. The work of the management needs to be done. It needs to be brought down to practical levels of activity which ensure that the goals can actually be fulfilled. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I provide lots of resources to help with this work of organization. I provide, tons of resources explaining the curriculum, study plans, recommended courses for grade levels, recommended programs overall, like a high school diploma program, whether one pursues it or in full or in part. I've done a lot of this administrative work for homeschooling families. And so a lot of this work, to some degree, I wouldn't say you can just use what I've done and that be that, because your circumstances are different. And so I think everything to some degree needs to be customized to your unique situation. But the core of the work, the bulk of the administrative work, I think I've already done that foremost families who share the goals that we talk about in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And you can see all of that in our study center and in our planning resources and records and things like that. We provide just really an incredible amount of resources to help with this organization, from suggested schedules, principles of scheduling that I think are helpful and realistic, study plans that lay things out down to the task level, the study center itself, which breaks all of the courses down to lessons and activities within lessons, all of the graded assessments in our program. We also provide all the study materials, but we provide automatically scored quizzes and writing assignments. All of the grades are recorded. All of this administrative, all of this practical work has been provided for homeschooling parents to make use of. And that continues all the way through the end to college and career preparation, transcripts, diplomas, all that stuff. We provide everything that's needed for this work of organization. But, as I said, there's a degree to which it's got to be customized to be useful in your unique circumstances. But that work of organization has to be done. We've got to establish an environment conducive to learning. We've got to develop a balanced schedule to provide for a good life, not just academic work, but also physical health, spiritual life, sacramental life, community and social responsibilities, and so on. And we've got to look at our circumstances, look at our situation as we think about homeschooling and ask ourselves, where is there going to be trouble? Where is the trouble going to come from? When is the trouble going to come? And how can we prepare for that and either prevent it or overcome it when it does come? That's all the work of administration. And the parents are the administrators of their homeschool. So the third key to success in homeschooling is that it has to be organized. We get this unschooling group within homeschool circles. That's just foolishness. The work that we've got to do requires more organization, not less. We need to be more disciplined, more principled, more organized than modern schools, not less. Anyone who suggests that we should be doing less is just crazy. We've got to be organized. Number 4, we've got to be realistic. This is one of the biggest challenges in homeschooling, is that parents are simply not realistic. We've got to be realistic. We've got to have expectations for our homeschooling, for our children's work as homeschool students, that actually fits within our real life circumstances. We have all different circumstances. It's sometimes hard to acknowledge that our circumstances limit what we can do. And I would even go further and say our circumstances often limit what we should attempt to do. Our circumstances often limit what we should attempt to do. St. Paul warns in the New Testament, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. David says in the Psalms that he will not reach after things that are too great for him. And there's a danger. There's a danger of looking at our lives, looking at homeschooling, looking at our families, looking at our children, our work as parents, and imagining that we're going to do things that historically, realistically, we're likely not going to do. And having unrealistic goals, unrealistic expectations can lead us to complete failure. So we've got to be careful to have realistic expectations for homeschooling, realistic expectations. So what does that really mean? What does it mean to have realistic expectations? Well, for example, if you're a parent who has never studied much, you're probably not going to raise the next Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, when we look at the greatest people in history, we look at someone like Thomas Aquinas in academics, we look at Mozart in music, and so on. We often tell ourselves, well, we could raise the next Mozart, we can raise the next Aquinas. But the problem is there's a combination that's necessary where we need both gifts and resources and work. The gifts have to be present, the resources have to be present, and the diligence has to be present. And when we have these things all come together, we often have the greatest results. We have the Thomas Aquinas, we have the Mozart. Thomas Aquinas, for example, was raised in a Catholic family, was sent to live in a monastery when he was 5 years old. You've got extraordinary gifts, extraordinary resources, and you've got incredible diligence all coming together. You've also got just amazing providences, like the opportunity for Thomas Aquinas to be taught by St. Albert the Great. Just all of these things coming together in God's providence to produce these great historic individuals. Mozart's family, likewise, was a musical family that worked in music professionally, where Mozart could not only be gifted and industrious in his playing, but also have the resources around him, the teaching, the organization, the focus, and so on, that allowed him to devote himself to that work and become the prodigy that he was. So there are circumstances involved in these success stories. And when we look at ourselves, we've got to ask, what gifts, what resources, what opportunity is there? And if these things are diminished, we've got to adjust our expectations, because we can accomplish relatively great things if we're realistic. But if we're not realistic, we risk losing what we could have accomplished by having an unrealistic or even silly notion of something far beyond our reach that ends up causing the whole thing to fail. Think about our Lord's warning about a king who goes to battle and he fails to calculate whether he has the men and the resources to resist the enemy. He risks losing his whole army because he doesn't carefully consider the reality of his circumstances. And many parents do that in homeschooling. And unfortunately, this is encouraged by the homeschooling marketing and publishing industry, because they love puffing up, I should say, homeschool parents to think that there's no limit to what they can do, just to sell more and more stuff, really unsustainable plans for how to homeschool, models for homeschooling that are just not realistic. And so we've got to be careful to think about our circumstances and be realistic. And I'll give you a quick example of my own life. I'm the first Catholic in my family. My parents are not Catholics. My mother converted later, but I was not raised Catholic. My parents were working class people. I was not raised in an academic environment. School was really not a big deal in my family. I didn't do well in school as a kid growing up because, like I said, it just wasn't our family's thing. I didn't get serious about studies until after I converted to Christianity as a teenager, and as part of my conversion, I believe that I received gifts that were useful in academics and learning. But I really had no support, no resources academically, nothing outside of myself. So when I went into homeschooling, and the same is true of my wife comes from an evangelical family, not a Catholic family. But when we went into homeschooling, there were no other homeschool people around us. There were no other Catholics around us that were concerned as we were about their children's education. And we had to really pursue the work. Obviously, as classicists who work in education, we did have some resources. We did have a degree of giftedness and opportunity and diligence, but we also had many obstacles, many deficiencies. And so we had to learn to adjust our expectations as parents and teachers for our children so that we could avoid aiming too high and cause harm. And by setting realistic expectations, actually fulfill them and do so in a way that's responsible, peaceful, and so on. Early on, as I said, this was one of the areas that we had to learn by experience, and we made mistakes when we were younger because our expectations, I would argue, were not realistic. We were aiming way too high. And while some of the things, for me as a teacher, I could pursue certain goals or certain standards with other people's children because they were actually in better circumstances. But I couldn't do those same things with my own children because we were in inferior circumstances. A quick example, I was tutoring a family here in Charlotte, wealthy family, multi-generations of Catholics on both sides, and this beautiful Catholic family in a beautiful parish, one of the best parishes in our diocese, with just layers and layers of Christian relatives, grandparents, uncles, aunts, tons of friends being connected in the Catholic community for years and years. I would visit their family to teach and help their children and also provide consultation to the parents, but I would have their grandparents ask if they could visit with us and sit in on my classes with the kids just because they enjoyed the lessons and discussions. And when I got to see just how rich the Catholic culture was in those families, it helped me to realize that my children are being raised in very different circumstances than those children. And, I had to learn that by experience. One of those kids went on to become a priest in our diocese and sort of fulfilled the expectations that I had for him as a student. But when I looked at my own children, I realized that it would be unreasonable, really unfair to think that they should bear the same kinds of fruit in the same amount of time that those children in that other family should bear. And I had a number of families that I worked with that were like that, where I could really push those kids and really pursue high-level things because there was so much support and reinforcement. Whereas for my children, when my wife or I were not present, there was no Catholic influence in their lives. And that's a very significant difference caused by those different circumstances. In the families that I've worked with through the years, I've seen every imaginable difference in circumstances, from single parents trying to raise children to, again, Catholics that are just part of these huge Catholic families that extend in the church through many generations with amazing resources, all of the benefits of just generations of good Catholic living, all coming down to those children. And so the range or the spectrum of circumstances is very, very broad. And we've got to have a realistic evaluation of where we are on that spectrum as a family and what's reasonable, what's realistic to expect for our homeschooling. That's a very important evaluation to make, very difficult for young couples who really don't necessarily have the means of thinking through that and recognizing a self-awareness of where they are in that spectrum. So that's a real challenge. We've got to have realistic expectations. And obviously, that's one of those issues where it's very important for young couples or inexperienced couples with young children usually to get connected with experienced married couples who are homeschooling, who've had children, who've raised adults, to get some feedback, to get some advice and input in those things. It's important to have counselors available that you can rely on and ask questions. And my wife and I are happy to provide the help of our own experience if we can. So we've got to have realistic expectations. Next, number 5. Number 5, we've got to be resilient. We've got to be resilient. We've got to anticipate difficult times in homeschooling for many different reasons. There are many different causes of difficulty in homeschooling. Some of them are present in us as the parents. Some of them are present just in God's providence in our lives, different changes or difficulties that come along. I've had families we've worked with who just all of a sudden found themselves immersed in some great family trial where a relative becomes sick or a parent dies or something unexpected happens, and it's like all of life is turned upside down, and they go from this peaceful, orderly, happy homeschooling life to all of a sudden having their whole life disturbed by an inevitable providence in their family. So there are going to be difficult moments, all kinds of things. Women going through their childbearing years are going to have difficult pregnancies one time around, and an easy pregnancy another time around, and a difficult pregnancy another time around. Children born with different conditions. You could have a child who's got a health problem from early years. You just never know what the circumstances are going to be. And so getting back to collaborating together as husband and wife, being principled, as I said, being organized, so even when difficulties come, you can adjust schedules, adjust the use of resources, adjust budgets, and so on. By having these things in place, you can absorb these difficulties and be resilient, persevere through them, and eventually, with the help of God's grace, overcome them. So you've got to learn to be resilient. You've got to learn that difficulty is not a sign that something's wrong. Difficulty is just normal when we're pursuing lofty things. It's like walking up a staircase. You're trying to get from the first floor to the second floor. It's going to be difficult because you're moving upwards. You're moving against the force of gravity. You've got to push yourself up the stairs. And that feeling of difficulty is because you're moving from one level to another. There's always going to be difficulties, and we've got to be resilient. That's very important. We've got to be resilient. That's number 5. Many homeschooling parents enter into difficulties and they either don't expect them or they just refuse to become resilient. And as soon as things get difficult, they start second-guessing everything. They start doubting whether they should homeschool. They start thinking whether they should just quit and just send the kids to school. But in those times where we're tempted to quit, we have to go back to the principles that we started with, because those principles likely haven't changed. And just because the circumstances get difficult, we can't let go of those principles. And that's why, again, it's important to be principled. That's what actually helps us to be resilient when the going gets tough. So number 5 is we need to be resilient. We need to work through difficult times in homeschooling. And like I said, they are innumerable what the sources of those difficulties can be. Number 6, we need to be patient. We need to be patient. One of the problems that homeschool parents have is that many times they're not experienced as teachers. They don't know what it feels like to lead a student to bear the fruits of learning in different subjects. They don't know what the timeline feels like. They don't know when to expect the fruits. And so they often become impatient and they start to get anxious, or they think that they're failing, or they think that there's something wrong with their child or with the curriculum they're using or with the method that they're following, whatever. And they're simply looking for or expecting fruits too soon or at the wrong time. So parents have to learn to be patient. They've got to allow time for fruits of discipline to be born. Parents often ask me, how should we progress? How many lessons should a child get done in a certain time? How hard should I push the child? And this has to do with this question of patience and allowing time for fruits to be born. My advice to parents on this issue is you should not just push your children, but help your children as much as you can until you've pushed them to a point where you can see that they're starting to break down. They're tired, or they're frustrated, or they're just exhausted and getting unhappy generally with their work and education. And you need to learn when it's time to take a break. You need to learn when it's time to refresh. That's why, again, going back to organization, it's important to have a balanced schedule where we can, have times to push and have times to unwind and decompress. But we've got to push as hard as we can to help our children develop stamina for studies, to develop strength, just like developing physical strength for sports or athletic activities. We've got to develop mental strength and the strength of their attention, the stamina of their attention span, and so on. So we've got to push them, but we've got to know when to take a break. And those kinds of decisions for inexperienced teachers or inexperienced parents, those decisions are very hard to make. And that's, again, why I think it's important to be connected to other families, especially experienced families, where they can offer some practical help with how to make those decisions. So we've got to know when to expect fruits to be born. And I'll give you a couple practical examples. First of all, the church teaches that children come to the age of reason around 7 or 8 years of age. I'll often get contacted by parents who are stressing out because their children are 6 or 7 years old and they're not seeing them progress in this or that activity. And I stop them and I say, you're asking about the intellectual progress of a 6-year-old, and you haven't even given the child time yet to reach the age of reason where learning really begins. So you're just looking for certain fruits prematurely. You're looking for them at the wrong season, and you need to relax and allow time for those fruits to be born. And so that 7-8-year-old age is an important transitional period in the kids' lives, in their development. And parents need to know that. They need to know not to look for the fruits of reasoning before the age of reason has even arrived. Secondly, when children get into their teenage years, when they go through puberty, they also become much bigger and stronger physically and mentally. And again, I often find parents with younger children, 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old, complaining that the kids have no attention span, they can't work for extended periods of time, they get tired very quickly. And we're asking children unreasonably to produce a certain quantity of work or a certain difficulty level of work while they're still physically developing. They haven't reached that period of puberty or teenage years where they really increase in size and strength, not just muscular strength, but also mental strength. And so they gain strength in their teenage years, which is why we always say that age 13 or 14 is an important transitional phase, because we enter into the 4 years of high school where we've got big, strong kids to work with who can be pushed really hard, but we're not going to expect that kind of work from an 11-year-old. And so you can just see how looking for certain fruits at inappropriate times can produce frustration, can lead homeschool families to make bad decisions, even to give up. And so you've got to have a good sense of when different fruits are to be expected, so you don't look for them prematurely. You've got to be patient, and that takes experience. So that's the 6th thing, patience. 7th, you've got to learn to be contented. You've got to learn to be content. And by contentment, I mean you've got to learn to be satisfied with the results. You've got to learn when to be satisfied with the results. The main source of satisfaction comes from reflecting on your own effort. And if we think about the points that I've discussed, if you think back and say, well, have we collaborated as we need to in our children's education? And you can say, yes, we've worked to collaborate. Have we followed good principles? Yes, we've followed good principles. Have we been organized? Have we made practical preparations that would give our children the chance to succeed in fulfilling the goals that we set? And we can say, yes, we've been organized. Have we had realistic expectations? Yes, we've had realistic expectations. Have we been resilient? Have we worked through difficult times and overcome adversity? Yes, we've done that. We've worked through all kinds of difficulties and have persevered. Have we been patient? Have we sought fruits at proper times? Yes, we've learned what to expect when, and we haven't, panicked or become anxious by looking for things at the wrong time. We've done all these things well. When we start to look at what we've done in homeschooling, there needs to be a sense of contentment to say that we fulfilled our duty, that we did what we could. And there are a number of objective measures that I like to recommend to parents to help them have a sense of contentment. First of all, just very simply, have your children satisfied grade level requirements. And I'm not saying grade level requirements are the goal of classical Catholic education. Obviously, that's not true. But just speaking in simple terms, have your children satisfied grade level standards as they move through the years? And you can measure this with a simple standardized test. We make the tests available, by the way. But you can measure this with an annual standardized test administered at home at the end of the school year. And you can say, my child's 10 years old. She just finished what would have been her fourth grade year. So let's give her a fourth grade standardized test and see how she does. And so you go through the test and you get the results and you say, she did great. She satisfied all the requirements for fourth grade. You can see how that provides some objective source of satisfaction or contentment to say, hey, praise the Lord. We led our daughter successfully through fourth grade requirements, and we also did a lot more. We studied the Bible, we studied the Catechism, we went to Mass once or twice a week, we did this and that, we took time as a family, we visited Grandma every Tuesday. You can see how satisfying the grade level requirement, which is the public school standard, and just checking that off gives you a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. That is a positive for you to look at in homeschooling, and you can be content with that, to know that we satisfied the standard and went beyond that and did more. Another very important source of satisfaction in homeschooling is the sacrament of confirmation. And I know that there are some communities that will administer the sacrament of confirmation when children are young, but normally it's offered in the high school years around age 15 or so. And there's a sense of freedom in the child going through with the confirmation, and the church, usually in the person of the bishop through requirements that he himself establishes, saying to us, your child is approved. Your child has successfully been brought up in the church and has satisfied the requirements to receive the sacrament of confirmation in the Catholic Church. That's a very important milestone that for us parents should be looked at as a checkpoint with which we should be content. So there are these checkpoints, and I would recommend that we look at them as a sort of minimum requirement, not to disrespect the sacrament of confirmation, but to look at them as minimum requirements and say, we got those things done. And then look at the rest of what we do as being done in excess of those basic goals, and learning to be content with what we're able to get done in our unique circumstances. So rather than making excuses, rather than getting frustrated and playing a blame game, or even getting into sinful behaviors where we're angry and resentful and frustrated because this caused this delay and this interrupted this, learning to look at some reasonable, measurable checkpoints and say, we accomplished these things. We've done well with what we've done, and we've gone beyond that. We say things like the goal of life is to leave the world a little bit better than it was when you were born into it. And we can look at our children and say, like, no, I didn't raise a son to be the next Thomas Aquinas or the next Mozart. But what I did is raise a son who's a step better than I was at age 18. And I think that I can be content knowing that I didn't produce someone worse than myself or someone worse than my own generation, but I raised 4, 5, 6, in my case, 10 children who I can look at age 18 and say, he's in a better place at age 18 than I was. And I can be content with that as an achievement as a parent. So we've got to learn to be content, to know that we did what we could, that we tried our best, we followed the steps that were necessary to be successful. We fulfilled a great need. Again, if we deemed homeschooling to be necessary because of a lack of good education where we live, we can be content that we fulfilled that need and got quite a bit done and prevented many potential problems that we might have had to deal with, or that our children might have had to deal with had we not homeschooled them. So we have to learn to be content, to have a positive mindset, and not to beat ourselves up over the could've, would've, should'ves that were just not in our control. We've got to learn to be content with getting done what we could get done, and we need to learn to offer that to the Lord as our morning offering, and just say, I offer you everything that I've been able to do, all that I can control, I offer to you for the intentions of your Sacred Heart. We offer our intention, we offer our works and prayers, our joys and sufferings through the Immaculate Heart of Mary, for the intention of our Lord's Sacred Heart, for reparation for our own sins, for the intentions of our own children, for our relatives. You can see how this whole life all works together. And we have to learn to be content with what's realistically possible for us in this work of parenting and homeschooling. So we've got to learn to be content. And that's very difficult, especially when many are tempted to perfectionism. I get this all the time from parents, just so unhappy and struggling so much because of a perfectionist mindset that is going to hinder them from making progress and actually being happy in their work of homeschooling. It never works. It feels good to talk like a perfectionist, but it's actually a vice and not a virtue. Also, our relationships with our children, they can be injured if we expect from them or look for them to produce things that should not be expected. We can be angry at them, we can be critical of them, we can have a negative attitude towards them, and they can feel that. And it's not fair because it's not realistic and we're not practicing godliness with contentment. So that's the challenge of contentment. That's the 7th point that I'd like to share. What's necessary for success in homeschooling. Number 8, there are actually going to be 9 in this talk. Number 8, we've got to look at homeschooling as a spiritual activity. It's an apostolate. It's what we do to serve the Lord in our lives. And it's got spiritual benefits for us as individuals and for our children. We've got to look at homeschooling as a spiritual work that we have undertaken. Think about the works of mercy. One of the spiritual works of mercy, think about it. A spiritual work of mercy is to instruct the ignorant. And we do that in homeschooling. We practice this work of mercy in homeschooling. The scriptures teach us that whom a father loves, he chastens. We discipline our children. We put them under a schedule. We make them study. We make them do certain things. We bring them to church. We make them follow a schedule, do chores, and so on. We discipline them. We bring them under discipline because we love them. It's an act of love. It's a work of mercy. And it's very difficult, and we learn from that work. We learn to become merciful. We learn to actually practice charity. One good mystery from the Rosary to meditate on in this is the Visitation, the second of the joyful mysteries. I often meditate on the Visitation and think Mary finds out that she's going to become the mother of the Savior. She receives the message in the Annunciation. She learns that she's going to become pregnant and bear a son. And she also learns that her cousin Elizabeth is also pregnant. And what does Mary think to do? She thinks to go and visit her cousin. And I think we overlook that, but how many women find out that they're pregnant and think to go visit someone else? And Mary stays with Elizabeth. The scriptures tell us she stays with her for 6 months. So Mary goes through 6 months of her own pregnancy, visiting her cousin Elizabeth. And when we offer the decade of the Rosary, as we meditate on the Visitation, the virtue that we pray for the grace of love for our neighbor. So if we think about the Visitation, we take concern for the needs of others. We put ourselves second. We can see how that applies to the work of homeschooling, where we're adjusting our life, we're changing our daily work, our schedule, using our resources for the good of our children. It's a work of mercy that we're doing, and it's going to be very difficult because it's contrary to our nature. We're inclined to selfishness. We're inclined to not be merciful. We're inclined not to be charitable, and so on. So the work of homeschooling is going to be difficult because we're going to be challenged to grow spiritually to fulfill it. It's not going to be easy. And we need to think about the promises that Christ makes to us. He says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." He says this in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. So when we deal with our children in homeschooling and we're provoked by their bad behavior, or we're irritated by difficulties in our day-to-day activities, or by the disturbances that I mentioned before, we have the opportunity to learn to become merciful with the hope that as we practice mercy, as we do the works of mercy, we ourselves will receive God's mercy. And so we have this as this spiritual, devotional life, this apostolate of homeschooling that becomes our spiritual life. And that's especially true for the mothers who handle this work of homeschooling day by day on the ground, as it were. But it's also true for the fathers, as I mentioned before. It's often best for the fathers to devote themselves exclusively to the work of managing the household, working to provide for all of the needs of the family, providing the wife and children with a safe and peaceful place to live where this homeschooling activity can be conducted, and so on. And the father himself has to take on a very merciful character, thinking of the corporal works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving shelter to the homeless. He's doing all of these things for his own wife and children. He's practicing the works of mercy as well, and he can learn to do so not just to provide for the bare minimum requirements, but to be generous in that provision, thinking of not just what's barely necessary, but what would make it pleasant, what would make it beautiful, what would make it more enjoyable, and so on. Easier, more convenient for his wife and for the children. He can learn to be generous and merciful in that work of providing for the family. So this undertaking, this work of homeschooling, it is our spiritual life. And what I often see parents do, especially mothers again, and I guess fathers as well, is they get something of a Protestant notion of a devotional life, which is really just entirely intellectual or literary, or has to do specifically with time spent in some kind of formal prayer. And they despise the works of mercy as if they're not spiritual activities, where both are part of our spiritual life. Yes, we need to participate in the sacraments. We need to say our prayers. We need to read scripture. We need time for contemplation, but we also need to put the faith into practice, because if we don't have charity, then the fruit of the Spirit is not even present in us, and we're in big trouble. So we need to see this work of homeschooling not as something separate from our spiritual life, but really the work that flows from, that overflows from our love for God and that benefits our children. It needs to be seen as our spiritual work. We need to see ourselves being sanctified by the work that we undertake in raising and educating our children. We're not simply working to make them holy. This work is the means by which we can be made holy. It's sanctifying for us. It's spiritual for us. It's much more than just academics. It forms not only our soul, but the souls of our children. We can offer all of these difficulties, all of the struggles, all of the successes, all of the difficulties. We can offer them all as spiritual sacrifices to God. We can really learn to see homeschooling as our family's path to God's grace, and a work that begins with God's grace, is directed by God's grace, proceeds with the help of God's grace, and leads to God's grace. It really is a spiritual work, and we need to learn to think of it like that. And then lastly, I'm sorry I said there were 8 things. There are actually 9 things I wanted to talk about. The 9th key to success in homeschooling is that it's ongoing. It doesn't stop when our children reach age 18 or get their high school diploma. It continues throughout life. The work of homeschooling is ongoing. And I'd like you to think about the parable of the prodigal son. I'm amazed at how many times the parable of the prodigal son answers questions that I have as either a parent or a teacher. But if we think about the life of the prodigal son, we see the son is raised in his father's house and apparently raised well, because the father is presented to us as a good man. He's raised well, he chooses to leave, he falls into all kinds of sin. And then after he's fallen into sin, after he's gained this experience in the world, and he comes to the realization that the world and the pleasures of the flesh are not all that he thought they would be, and he now has learned by experience that the life of his father is actually better than the life of sin. It says he comes to his senses and he wants to return home. And we have this famous scene of the prodigal son going home and being received joyfully by his father. What we see in that parable is the ongoing relationship between parents and their children. It's not something that ends when a child moves out. It's not something that ends when a child graduates. It's something that's going to go on. Many times we're going to raise our children in the faith, and when they come to that time of independence, they're going to go off and they're going to abandon what we've taught them. And it's not a crisis. It's not some terrible situation. It's just normal because they've never handled independence before. And they've got all kinds of ideas about what the world might be like or what life would be like if they didn't go to church or if they didn't waste time in prayer, if they didn't do what their parents taught them to. They've got all kinds of ideas about the world, all with no experience. And it's just a natural and necessary part of their life for them to go through early adulthood and experiment with their ideas, experiment with their questions, their curiosities, and so on. And they're going to learn through those early adult years the truth of the Catholic faith and Catholic morals. And so that relationship is going to continue through those years because the parents are going to stay in touch. They're going to continue to maintain good relations. They're going to talk about things. The parents are going to be understanding and discuss things with them and continue to direct them and encourage them and assure them of their love and patience. And then the children are going to gain experience and they're going to come to their senses eventually and reconnect with their parents and begin to change their opinions and begin to see the wisdom and the reason in the things their parents told them. And that relationship between the homeschooling parents and the children is going to continue. It's ongoing. It doesn't stop when formal education, when high school education ends, or when childhood ends. It continues on through life. You know, my oldest children are 24 and 26 years old. We still talk every day about things that we've been talking about since they were kids. And we've gone through all of these ups and downs with them, and they've come to see the truth of this or that, and they still don't agree with this and don't think we're right about that. But these relationships continue. They're ongoing. And our desire to help lead them safely to eternal happiness, that's ongoing and will continue throughout their lives as long as we live. And so we shouldn't get stressed to think that because this or that was not in place at age 18, or because the child chose to hang a left as soon as he left home, or to stop going to Mass on Sundays, or this or that, and he experimented with this idea he had and started learning about this philosophy and that religion and tinkered with this and that. That's part of our children's own journey in the Christian life. And they're going to see the inferiority of many of those things, especially if we remain in touch and continue living faithfully. And they're going to return to the things that they learned when they were young, as the scriptures teach. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So we've got to see the importance of again, being patient, looking for fruits at the right time, and realize that this is going to be an ongoing relationship that continues through adulthood. It's going to be the lifelong relationship that we continue with our children. And we're not to take a snapshot on graduation day and say, that's the finish line, time's up. That's not true. Time continues all through life. Homeschooling is an ongoing pursuit. So those are the 9 things that I wanted to share. Those are things that I think are necessary for success in homeschooling, and I'll recite them one more time just for the sake of memory. Number 1, homeschooling should be collaborative. Number 2, it should be principled. Number 3, it should be organized. 4, it should be realistic. 5, it should be resilient. 6, it should be patient. 7, it should be contented. 8, it should be spiritual. And 9, it should be ongoing. If we get these 9 things right in homeschooling, I think we'll have success. If we get these things right, and I'm sure that if you're homeschooling your children, as you think about these things, you can think of one or more that you're not getting right. And the good news is that you're aware of it and you've got the opportunity to fix it. And again, what I'd like to recommend is if you're available, if you join us on Wednesday nights, this is the kind of stuff we talk about. We talk about it. It's a private meeting. It's not recorded or anything. We talk about these issues. We talk about the nuts and bolts of family life and homeschooling. I think we talk about it quite honestly and openly. And we get into these things and talk about different circumstances and details. And we talk about it in a general way so it's helpful to everyone. But we share our own experiences and the details of our own circumstances. And that allows us to really dig into these things. So if you'd like to talk about these things on a regular basis, consider joining us for our Wednesday night parent meetings. They're free to attend, but you need to register in order to join us because it's a Zoom meeting, so you've got to get the Zoom link. So if you go to the Academy website, you can find the registration information and get yourself signed up. But if you're a homeschooling parent, we'd love to have you join us. Other than that, if there are any questions you'd like to ask, or if you'd like me to dive into any of these topics in more detail, you've got some specific thoughts or questions you'd like to have me think through and share, just let me know. You can write to me anytime. My email address is mail@classicalliberalarts.com. And just like our Wednesday meetings, by continuing to reflect on these topics and discuss these issues over time, we can go deeper and deeper into them, and that's when we really start to find the fruit of these reflections. So if there's anything that you'd like to comment on, feel free to comment on the YouTube channel. If you'd like to ask any questions or suggest future topics, please do so. It's very helpful to get that feedback. So anyway, I hope that this has been helpful. If you're in the midst of this work of homeschooling, God bless you. I'd like you to know that I pray for families in the CLEA every day, every Mass, every Rosary. I always try to remember CLEA families and pray for their success and for God's blessing. So be persevering. Make sure you think about these things. And as I said, if you get these things right, I think you can expect to have success in homeschooling. I hope that's helpful. God bless.